Okay, well, welcome back, folks. We have been studying the Civil War in the Ozarks for the last few weeks, and today we're finally going to fight the Battle of Wilson's Creek, which was the largest battle of the Civil War in the state of Missouri, and actually probably the second largest battle west of the Mississippi River. So it's a very important battle for the Civil War and for the state of Missouri. So let me first of all do my screen share here. Okay. Maybe if I can get this going. There we go. Okay, so we are studying the Civil War in the Ozarks. And today we're going to talk about the Battle of Wilson's Creek, August 10th, 1861, quite a few years ago. If you don't remember, that happens to be the 40th anniversary of when the state of Missouri became a state. This is my notable Ozarkers, Missourian of the day. Now, I'm kind of fudging a little bit here. He really wasn't born in Missouri. He didn't spend most of his life in Missouri, but he played a very important part of his life in Missouri. Of course, that's Ulysses S. Grant. I'm sure some of you recognized him right off the bat. Famous Civil War general for the Union. He married a woman from St. Louis and ended up living outside of St. Louis, a place called Grant's Farm. And I'm sure some of you have probably been there. I think it's owned by the Anheuser-Busch Corporation now. And it's a really big deal. I've been there a couple of times with my daughter as we visited her in St. Louis. And it's a really interesting place to visit. So let's talk a little bit about the Civil War in general. I thought I'd start off today by showing you a little 4-minute film clip about food. You know, I think we tend to forget sometimes just exactly how much these soldiers suffered in daily life. And so I'm going to kind of show you this film clip, and it'll give you an idea of what kind of food they ate. I think it's a good idea that we do this. So here we go.
When Union veteran John D. Billings wrote his classic history of soldier life, Hardtack and Coffee, he devoted an entire chapter, 34 pages to be exact, to Army rations, how they were issued, and how they were cooked. His primary aim was to dispel the false impressions that had come about regarding what soldiers ate. Now, one of the most widely known pieces of Civil War food was hardtack. Hardtack was a soldier's bread ration and had been around since the Crusades. The version of hardtack issued to Civil War soldiers was invented in 1801 by a man named Josiah Bent. Bent called his concoction a water cracker, and for good reason. The recipe, if you could call it that, had 2 ingredients, flour and water, which were then mixed into a paste and baked. The result was a dry cracker that would stay more or less edible for an extended period of time. And I do mean extended. In fact, some Civil War soldiers received issues of hardtack that had been left over from the Mexican War more than 10 years earlier. The longevity of a single piece of hardtack depended greatly on how it was made and how it was stored. Improperly packaged or underbaked biscuits could become infested with maggots or weevil larvae, prompting many soldiers to call them maggot castles. And even when properly cared for, the crackers were incredibly tough, leading many soldiers to call them flour tiles, toothbreakers, and other names. The solution to both problems was one and the same: break up the cracker and boil it. Soldiers would break up the hardtack with the butts of their muskets and boil it in hot water or coffee, which would then cause the maggots and weevil larvae to float to the surface, allowing soldiers to skim them off the top and continue drinking their cup of joe. Boiling hardtack in coffee also gave the hardtack itself at least some degree of flavor. These, of course, were not the only food items issued to the Civil War soldier. Each day, a soldier in one of the U.S. armies was entitled to 1 pound of meat and 1 pound of bread. Now, occasionally, fresh beef was the meat ration, but more often than not, they got pork. And this pork was salted for preservation, and it was known then as salt pork or sometimes salt horse, which gives you an idea of how it tasted. For bread, hardtack was generally the rule, but when armies were encamped in winter quarters or in the same place for a long period of time, they might have access to soft bread. An example of this is when Joe Hooker took command of the Army of the Potomac in the spring of 1863 and ordered that ovens be built outside of the Army's camps so that soft, fresh bread could be issued to his soldiers. Now, bread and meat were issued to soldiers individually. Other items, however, were issued in larger quantities of 10 or 15 pounds, which would then be split up among 100 soldiers or so. Items in this category included beans, peas, rice, sugar, and of course, coffee. As you can probably guess, this was the ration under the best of circumstances, and soldiers didn't always get all they were entitled to. For instance, beans and rice were not issued to soldiers on the march, and fresh bread was usually one of the first luxuries to go. It's also worth pointing out that even Civil War soldiers knew that even the most fulsome ration was lacking in key vitamins and nutrients, so much so that it was not uncommon for officers to use their own money to supplement their troops' diet. An example of this is Captain Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts, who will have his family in Boston send onions and lemons to his troops in Virginia to help supplement their diet. Now, mostly what we've talked about so far pertains primarily to the Union Army. Robert E. Lee's men at Appomattox were considerably less well-fed than their counterparts in the Army of the Potomac. However, this was not the case at the start of the war. The Confederate government adopted the U.S. Army standards for feeding its troops, with many men boasting that they got fed better in the Army than they did at home. Unfortunately for Johnny Reb, this didn't last very long. The Confederacy did not have the same manufacturing capability as the North, and southern ports were blockaded by the U.S. Navy. Even worse, the Confederacy's railway system was simply inadequate for moving the vast quantity of food required to feed the armies. On the eve of the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee recorded that his soldiers' daily ration consisted of 18 ounces of flour, 4 ounces of bacon, and the occasional issue of rice, sugar, or molasses. It's no wonder then that one of Lee's primary objectives in the Gettysburg campaign was to secure food and supplies for his literally starving army. Now, whether he ate the standard government issue or something appropriated from a local farm, the Civil War soldier was expert at making delicious dishes out of whatever they could get. Veterans' accounts are chock full of suggestions of things you could make, telling us that the Civil War culinary experience is only limited by our imagination.
Okay, so let's get started on this battle. Last week I told you that General McCulloch, the head of the Confederate forces, had encamped along the banks of Wilson's Creek with he had about a little over 10,000 soldiers armed with about 2,000 in reserves, setting back along the Old Wire Road. General Lyon, the head of the Union Army, had about 5,400 soldiers, but he had split his force. He had sent 1,200 of his troops under the command of Franz Sigel around to the south in an attempt to kind of do what was called a concentric move or a pincher move on the army. And his intent was to sneak up on McCulloch that night or early in the morning of August 10th. And he did that. Now, kind of setting the stage for the battle. I want you to think about this. August 10th, and I don't know how many are familiar with the Ozarks on the first part of August. It is usually extremely hot, extremely humid. And that night in particular, it had drizzled rain, and the next morning the sun was going to come up in its full fury, and it must have been like a sauna. The battlefield itself was covered in savanna grass, but it was also just full of rocks and prickly pears, which grew up from the ground and had thorns on them, covered in brush, particularly along the riverbank. It was just a really unpleasant situation, to say the least. And these soldiers would end up fighting for close to 6 hours in close contact. Folks, the Civil War was fought within yards. Now, although these arms, these weapons could fire and were accurate up to a certain degree, that's if they were fully tuned and if they were rifled, which many of them were just old squirrel muskets that hadn't been rifled. And so most of the combat in the Civil War was fought probably no further than half a football field from each other, and probably even closer than that on occasion, as we'll see here. So it was not a very healthy war, to say the least. It was not a very healthy battle. Lyon's advance force made its first contact with the Confederate troops just north of what we now know as Bloody Hill around 5 o'clock in the morning. Colonel Sigel had the German soldier that had gone around to the south had placed an artillery battle General or Commander Backoff's battery in position southeast of Sharp's cornfield. There were several houses on the battlefield, and one of them was Sharp on the southern side of the battlefield. Lyon ordered Plummer's infantry to cross Wilson's Creek and guard his vulnerable left flank. I'm a football fan, and I know a quarterback is always concerned about his left flank. That's kind of his blind side. And so, just like that, Lyon knew that his left flank was vulnerable to attack. So he sent a group of soldiers, an infantry unit over, and also had some artillery face that way. And then Lyon attacks. Remember, General Price, the head of the Missouri State Militia, is the commander of the Missouri State Militia. He is encamped on the west side of Wilson's Creek, whereas McCulloch is encamped on the east side of Wilson's Creek. And so it was Price's Missouri militia that bore the brunt of the battle with Lyon. McCulloch's troops were involved, particularly when it came to what we know as Ray's Cornfield, that battle. I'll show you that in a minute, and also cutting off Franz Sigel. But for the most part, it was General Price and to some degree, General Bart Pierce of the Arkansas State Militia that did the majority of the battle. So Sigel, hearing musket fire, begins opening up and driving off a cavalry unit that is encamped in Sharp's cornfield. And so he is doing his job. He's doing exactly what he intended to do. He's going to put the Confederate Army in a pincher move. He's going to block the old wire road, thus making sure the reserves can't come up or the Confederates cannot leave the battlefield. It's a great strategic move. It just doesn't work, as you'll see. McCulloch was then fully alerted to the battle in progress and prepared to countercharge. So McCulloch finally becomes engaged. It takes a while because, frankly, McCulloch doesn't really think it's a full-fledged battle. He thinks it's just a little skirmish. Remember, he was very disdainful of the Missouri State Militia, and he thought that the Missouri State Militia was just being scared and jumpy. Well, they weren't. They were having a big battle. So here's kind of a map for you that are unfamiliar with Wilson's Creek. This would have been the old wire road here. That's the main thoroughfare between Springfield, well, actually St. Louis and Fayetteville. And it was called the Old Wire Road because they'd strung a telegraph wire along it. And so that's what they called it. It used to be an Indian trail, but now it was actually kind of the interstate of the day. This is Wilson's Creek here. Wilson's Creek kind of crosses over right where Price and Pierce were camped and runs on south. Terrell Creek runs into it here. Skeggs Branch runs into it here. I don't know if any of you have ever been on the battlefield. These are all clearly marked. So Lyon, the Union general, his troops, about 4,200, come from the north. And this is kind of a hill that slopes down to the creek bank. It becomes known as Bloody Hill because this is where the majority of the battle is fought, in this area right here. This is where Price is encamped. This is where Pierce is encamped. There's where McCulloch is encamped. This is Sigel's first position. He eventually moves over into Sharp's cornfield and then eventually moves over to kind of block the old wire road. There are several houses. There's Sharp's house. Pardon me. There's the Ray house, which is the only house that was existing on the battlefield that is still standing today. There was a mill here, the Gibson's Mill, and there was a family called the Edgars that happened to be my great-great-great-grandmother's family, the Edgars. You might remember her as the one that came across the Trail of Tears. Her Indian name was Jingle Woman, and she ended up married a man, and they had a house here with their family. There's a cemetery still existing on the battlefield today. It's called the Edgar Cemetery. If you ever take the tour road, it's one of the first things you see as you do the tour road. So that's the battlefield from that angle. So this is a kind of a lithograph of the battle. This happens to be a lithograph of when General Lyon was shot. There's several lithographs out there. This is the most famous one that was done by the Courier Knives Company, and they did a lot of battle scenes from the battle, and this is one of them. So that goes for about an hour. Between 6 and 8, the battle really gets going. Price's forces, the Missouri State Militia forces, form quickly, and the battle lines are pretty much established on Bloody Hill at that point. Plummer, the Union infantry commander that has been sent over by Lyon to guard his left flank, enters Ray's cornfield, which is just right across the old wire road from John Ray's house, which I'll show you here in a minute. And he attacked the Confederate Army battery, which was situated on kind of right east of the old wire road. And it had been shelling Lyon's forces. And so Ray was intent on trying to take that battery down. They didn't get it done. By 7 o'clock, Sigel, on the southern edge, the German commander, had crossed Terrell Creek, and by 7:30 had routed Greer's cavalry and cut off any southern retreat down the old wire road. Everything was going perfect for the Union. I mean, it was just like it was drawn up on the battlefield. Unfortunately, sometimes plans go awry, as we know. At the same time, Plummer engaged the 3rd Louisiana and the 2nd Arkansas in a fierce battle in Ray's cornfield, but had to be forced to retreat. Folks, this was close hand-to-hand combat between Confederates and Union soldiers. Remember, this is August. The corn would have been way head high. And they were in this cornfield, and I don't know how many's ever been in a cornfield where the corn's up. It's not a pleasant place to be, let alone when somebody's shooting at you from 5 yards. It must have been just an absolutely miserable situation. And they're in hand-to-hand combat. They've got bayonets engaged. They're using shotguns, squirrel muskets, Springfield, Enfield rifles. They're probably hitting each other with rocks. I mean, it is a terrible little skirmish going on in Ray's cornfield. But the Confederate artillery finally drives the Union soldiers out of the battle, out of the Ray's cornfield. So, alerted to the Union advance from the south, the southern Louisiana then turns and marches down the old wire road. So McCulloch has been given word. He said, hey, there's Union troops on the southern side of the battlefield. So you need to go down there and get them because they're blocking the old wire road, keeping reserves from coming up, as well as keeping you potentially to advance off the battlefield if you lose this battle. So he sends the 3rd Louisiana down the old wire road to engage. He doesn't know it's Franz Sigel, but that's who he sends down there. So here's the second stage of the battle. You've got Lyon and Price engaged in fierce combat on Bloody Hill. You've got Plummer's unit has advanced into the cornfield, and then they have to retreat. Sigel has advanced from his original first. Eventually, he'll get over here. So that's kind of where we're at on that stage of the battle for about 6 to 8. So the battle is about 3 hours old now. It's been going on for 3 hours. That's the Ray house. That is the only existing house still on the battlefield today. If you don't know about the Wilson's Creek National Battlefield, it has a different mission than some Civil War battlefields. I've been to several Civil War battlefields, and they have statues and monuments and all this kind of stuff. The Wilson's Creek battlefield has a mission of restoring the battlefield to the original condition that would have been on the day of the battle. Now, it's a long ways from getting there, but it's a lot closer than most of the battlefields are, I can guarantee you. They want people to feel what it was like to be on the battlefield that day. They don't want them being distracted by a bunch of statues and monuments and all this kind of stuff. And they don't want any buildings on the battlefield that wasn't there, except for the visitor center, which, they have a very nice visitor center and museum on the battlefield if you've not been there. But this and the spring house across the road is the only existing structures that was still there at the time of the battle. Okay, this is raised cornfield across the old wire road. And this is where the majority of the early skirmish took place. By the way, somebody asked me, were these split rail fences, did they keep animals in? No, folks. Remember, this is open range time. Fences were built to keep animals out during the battle, during the Civil War era. So he would have built a split rail fence around his cornfield to keep animals out of the cornfield. And animals would have been allowed to just free range. They would have been, allowed to wander around eating whatever they could. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the battlefield kind of looks like to a degree today. So from 8 to 9, the battle kind of takes a lull. This always surprises people when I tell them this, but sometimes they just exhausted themselves. They'd been fighting for 3 hours. It was hot. They were probably dry. I mean, I guarantee you they were dry. They were hungry. They were probably running low on ammunition. And so there's a lull. Both sides kind of take a recess, kind of like a halftime of a football game. And they just kind of back off and take care of their injured or wounded as best they can, replenish their ammunition from supplies, maybe eat something real fast, drink something real fast, and then the whistle blows and the battle takes off again. I mean, there's not actually a whistle blown, but it's one of those kind of situations. It's almost like a halftime of a sporting event. And this happened a lot in the Civil War. Colonel Sigel misinterpreted the lull as a sign that Lyon had successfully defeated McCulloch. Remember, the battle had been going on for 3 hours. He thinks because there's a lull in the musket fire and the artillery fire, he can't really see what's going on because he's back to the south of the battlefield. He thinks the battle's over. And so he's thinking, man, this has worked out perfect. I blocked off any reserves and Lyon has done his job. But remember, there are Confederate forces. The 3rd Louisiana, it's called the Pelican Division, was walking down the old wire road. And they come up and they get almost, I've read where it was like 30, 40 yards from Sigel before Sigel realized it was Confederates. Now, remember, folks, this is very early in the war. This is only the second large battle. This is only the second large battle of the Civil War. The Battle of Bull Run was the first one. Uniforms had not been standardized. And so Confederates often wore butternut, just homespun brown clothing. Union armies, the organized army units, like LYON'S unit, wore blue uniforms. But a lot of them wore different things. For instance, the 1st Iowa was a militia unit from Iowa. Guess what color they wore? Gray. Just like the Confederate Army from the 3rd Louisiana, they wore gray. Sigel sees these gray-clad troops marching up the old wire road, thinking the battle has been won, thinking he is being approached by Lyon's army, and he's meeting up with them. And he's joyous. I've read where there were shouts and cheers from his soldiers, thinking that they had won the battle. Not so. In fact, it was the Confederate Army, and they ended up routing and killing or wounding almost all of Sigel's 1,200 soldiers. It was a disaster for the Union Army. Now, you can't totally blame Sigel because, again, he would not have understood that there would have been gray-clad troops on the battlefield that were Confederates. On top of that, almost all of his soldiers were Germans. This is one thing that Sigel was very good at, was recruiting German soldiers. And as a result, most of them spoke German for a first language. Some of them only spoke broken English. Most of the sub-commanders under Sigel were English speakers. They had a communication problem. So once the commanders realized it was Confederate Army instead of Union Army, they still could not get that communicated to the regular troops. The result was, folks, it was an absolute disaster for Lyon and Sigel. Sigel made it back to Springfield with a couple of guards. Other than that, most of his soldiers were absolutely routed or killed or wounded. It was a disaster for the Union Army. McCulloch now, after he routs the army, he goes back up to battle to Bloody Hill, and he starts reinforcing Price's men. Remember, Lyon's army is outnumbered like 2-1. And so it's just a huge disaster here in the making. So here's the third area of the battle. Here's the third section. Sigel is routed, and he's forced off the battlefield, opening up the old wire road. 3rd Louisiana routed him. Lyon and Price are once again just engaged in heavy combat on Bloody Hill. I mean, there were bodies laying all over this place. I mean, it was a horrible situation going on here. So this is the old wire road. This is, like I said, this is the interstate of the 1860s. This is what it would have looked like. This was the main thoroughfare from St. Louis to Fayetteville, Missouri, running right through Springfield and down southwest of Springfield to the Arkansas state line, and then south to Fayetteville. So from 9 to 10 is the fiercest part of the battle. It just goes crazy from 9 to 10. Remember, this is actually the 5th hour of the battle. It starts at 5. And so now it's into the 5th hour of the battle. And I mean, you can just imagine how tired these troops are. They were wearing old woolen uniforms. One had uniforms. It was hot. I'm going to say it was in the 90s at the very minimum. It was humid, like most August mornings are in the Ozarks. It would have just been, I can't even imagine, how they must have felt. Lyon is injured. He's shot. He shot off his horse, but he remains at the head of his army. He gets back up. He's injured. He's wounded with a charge from musket, but he orders himself to be brought another horse. He gets on it, and he continues to lead his army in battle. This is going to cease after this. They figure out real fast it's not a good idea to have your main commanders at the head of your army. That was traditional. But from this point on, you begin to see generals and commanders back behind the army, giving orders, and then people will go up and runners and communication people using flags, sometimes whistles, whatever, bugles, to alert their soldiers what to do. Because Lyon is eventually killed, and he is the first Union general killed in the Civil War on the battlefield. Very important thing. About 9:30, Lyon is leading the 2nd Kansas into battle, his original unit that he's with, when he shot off his horse. And the story goes that they laid him up against a tree, and all of his soldiers that were wounded kind of gathered around him, kind of protecting his body from what they would be scared was the battle. He was the first Union general killed in the Civil War. Now the command is now assumed by one of his majors, Major Samuel Sturgis. He's got a decision to make, folks. This battle has been raging for 5 hours, getting ready to enter into the 6th hour. His soldiers are exhausted. He knows that Sigel has been routed. They're running low on ammunition. They're running low on food. He has to make a decision. Do we stay and fight, or do we retreat? Do a strategic retreat back to Springfield? Now, before he can make that decision, there's a cavalry unit that tries to flank him, comes up behind him, but they're driven back off by Union artillery. And once again, Price's troops retreats off Bloody Hill to regroup. So Sturgis is holding the battlefield. He's actually in command of the battlefield, but he's got to make a decision. What do I do now? So here's what's going on. Lyon is killed. here at Bloody Hill, and I'll show you the marker in a minute. Price is driven off the battlefield, back south again. Greer's cavalry tries a flanking move and has to return back this way because they're driven off by artillery units here. So this is where Lyon was killed. Well, it's where most people assume he was killed. This was placed in 1928, as you can see, by something called the University Club of Springfield, Missouri. They went around and placed markers all over Greene County about important historical events in the 1920s. It says, at or near this spot fell Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon, born Ashford, Connecticut, 1818, graduated U.S. Military Academy, 1841, commander of the Federal Forces in the Battle of Wilson's Creek, August 10th, 1861. Markers erected by the University Club of Springfield, Missouri, in honor of General Lyon and the hundreds of brave men north and south who on this field died for the right as God gave them to see the right. There is a little bit of a not this marker is accurately placed. If you've been watching Dwayne's Bible study, you know that they have what they call stone stacks in the Bible. And you know that important events, they would stack stones in memory of it and kind of a thing. They did this at the battlefield. They placed a whole bunch of stones in kind of a little monument where they say General Lyon fell. And then later on, it was established where it was, and they placed this marker here. Again, there's some people that lived that wrote about it, said, no, he was killed somewhere else, but it doesn't really matter. You know, that's not important for us. The important thing is that he did sacrifice his life on the battlefield. So from 10 to 11:30, the battle heats up again, and it's some of the fiercest fighting of the day. Pierce, the Arkansas State Militia Guard, reinforces Price's troops now. McCullough's kind of taking advantage of the lull down south. He's got his artillery going. The Union Army is under a great deal of pressure at this point. They almost had the battle won. They almost had driven the Confederate forces off the battlefield. But once Sigel's forces were routed, that changed the whole complexion of the battlefield. And again, I'm not casting aspersion on Sigel and his forces because they just made an honest mistake, which could have been made in the fog of war. So even though the Southern attack was formidable, the Union force under Sturgis held steady. And once again, Price and Pierce were forced back off the battleground. So even though he's outnumbered, he's outgunned, he's just in terrible situation, he still holds the battlefield. But now he has to make a decision. It's been 6.5 hours since the battle's been going. I mean, it's just working on his soldiers. And at this point, he decides that it is a better thing to retreat off the battlefield, go back to Springfield, and pray for reinforcements. So McCullough makes a controversial decision also. So Sturgis takes his Union troops back off the battlefield and heads back to Springfield. McCullough makes a controversial decision because he didn't immediately go after him. Price is just furious. He said, why are we not chasing this army back to Springfield? We might even be able to beat them back to Springfield using the OR road and block them from getting back into Springfield. But McCullough, he's kind of like Sturgis. He's at this point like, hey, our troops are exhausted. We've got to replenish our supplies. We got to let our soldiers rest. And Price and McCullough just get into a huge argument. In fact, the case, it's so big that Price breaks away from McCullough after this and goes off on his own. He's so furious with what McCullough is doing that he can't stand it. He thinks that they should have chased Sturgis back to Springfield. So here's Sturgis retreating off battlefield, and the battle is basically over. 6.5 hours, of battle. It's just a gigantic battle and a really exhausting battle from about 5 to about 11:30. This is a scene from Bloody Hill. This is one of the reenactments they held on the battlefield in the past. By the way, most national parks now will not let you stage reenactments, full-fledged reenactments on the battlefield because of liability issues and all sorts of things. You know, we live in such a you know thing, and I think they were sued on occasion, and so they just decided they would not allow reenactments on the battlefield. So they are often done off the battlefield in adjacent land by land that's rented and has liability insurance. There's still exhibitions that go on, but they're not like reenactments. This is Major Sturgis. He is the commander of the Union forces now. By the way, Major Sturgis goes on to fight in the Civil War. He fights later. He becomes involved in the Indian Wars. He's actually nominally in command of the 7th Cavalry when General Custer, or pardon me, Colonel Custer, is annihilated at the Little Bighorn. So he has a long, decorated career ahead of him. So, one last thing, and then we'll quit here. About another 4-minute film on soldier gear. I thought you might be interested in seeing what the soldiers wore. So, let's look at this.
What did the Civil War soldier wear? In a word, everything. Whether he was Union or Confederate, the Civil War soldier was responsible for carrying all of his personal goods from camp on the march to the battlefield and all over again from the time he enlisted in 1861 till the time he went home in 1865. So starting with one of the most basic necessities, the soldier is going to wear his food, namely in a haversack. Typically, this included 3 days worth of bread, meat, and coffee, along with any cooking utensils that they would have. Their cooking utensils, by the way, they provide themselves. Water was carried in a canteen like this one. This is covered in jean cloth. Most canteens are covered in some sort of covering to help keep the water inside cool. Necessary for any soldier is their ammunition. The ammunition would be carried in the cartridge box right here. The cartridge box would probably weigh between 4 or 5 pounds because it is full of 40 rounds of lead that goes with it. So it seems easy to carry it on my body right now, but imagine this loaded down with 4 or 5 pounds. You've got an idea of what it might be like to carry this on the march. You'll also notice that I am wearing a knapsack. This is the regulation knapsack that would have been issued to soldiers in the Union Army. Confederates have them too, either by issue or more often from taking them from captured or dead Yankees. In here, I have a blanket, a change of clothing, my shelter half or half of a tent, which I would share with a buddy, and any other ground cloth that I might want to use to keep me protected from the elements. In other words, the knapsack is the soldier's house. There were many varieties of hats that were seen during the Civil War. The one I'm wearing now, the 1858 fatigue cap or forage cap, was by far the most common. Confederates often wore civilian hats, mostly due to a lack of enforcement of regulations in the Confederate armies. The next most obvious piece of clothing is the jacket or the coat worn by the soldier. Union troops wore blue most of the time. Confederates wore gray or some version of tan or butternut, sort of off gray color. There were also many varieties of coats used in both armies, but the average Civil War soldier would have been wearing what I am wearing now, which is a 4-button coat known as a sack coat or fatigue blouse. There's more variety in coats in the Confederate Army, where each state is providing different clothing for its own troops. And the trousers, along with the coat and even the cap, are all made of wool. For us today, it seems a little bit strange to be standing on a battlefield, say in July of 1863, and wearing wool outside in the sun. But we have to remember that wool actually wicks moisture away from the body, so it actually stays quite cool. And more importantly, wool is durable. Imagine marching through the woods at Spotsylvania Courthouse and getting caught on nettles and briars wearing an Under Armour shirt or a pair of cotton pants. You'd be torn up. But in a pair of wool trousers and in a wool jacket, that wool is going to withstand much more the rigors of the active life of a soldier. Soldiers in both armies would have been issued shoes or boots like the one I'm wearing. These are made of leather and they are also designed to be durable. Though remember, these are pegged soles, so sometimes they come apart, and that's why soldiers in both armies often go barefoot. Soldiers were also required to provide their own socks, so soldiers are frequently writing home asking for a new pair of socks from their loved ones. Soldiers in both armies would have been issued Canton flannel shirts, which they thought were itchy and uncomfortable. They often called them hair shirts, and many soldiers preferred to wear cotton shirtings like the one I'm wearing now. Last but not least, I have my musket, or my rifle musket. This is an 1861 Springfield, which was the standard issue long arm of the United States Army during the Civil War. Confederates also had access to some weapons like this, or its British counterpart, the 1853 Enfield, and there was also a number of different European varieties of the rifle musket that were used by both armies during the American Civil War. On my waist belt, I have a cap pouch, which carries the percussion caps, which are vital to the firing process of a rifle musket, as well as my bayonet. The bayonet attaches to the muzzle of the rifle musket, turning this firearm into a pike. Well, I suggest to you that if you want to understand the soldier experience of the American Civil War, put on one of their uniforms, wear the hat, wear the wool, carry the knapsack, and carry the rifle musket, and see what the weight of war feels like on your shoulders.
Okay, so that's it for today. Next week, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the battle and resulting Civil War engagements within the state of Missouri and Arkansas during the Civil War. And then after that, we're going to talk about the guerrilla war that went on inside the state of Missouri, which was just absolutely horrible. Probably the worst fighting of the Civil War in terms of guerrilla warfare took place in the Ozarks. It was just absolutely devastating. And then that will be it for the Civil War. We're going to take a couple of more weeks, and then we're going to go into the period after the Civil War, which is kind of a period of turmoil and at the same time rebirth. So I thank you for being with me today. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've learned something. And we will see you next week.